In sociology, there are different definitions of the state, which can generally be grouped in terms of political and sociological theories. In this short clip, these will be explored through two fundamental positions, the liberal and Marxist perspectives. We will explore how the state relates to current economic realities, such as the financial crisis and issues of legitimation. Odysseas Christou explains the origins of the liberal perceptions of the state.
Well, liberal theory, I would say, tends to be the starting point for the consideration of the state, and essentially, at least in the dominant way of thinking, from the Hobbesian perspective. You know, the conception of the Leviathan state as a kind of necessary evil. So the state becomes basically an imposition on freedom in the state of nature, where the sovereignty is defined not as the sovereignty of the state, but the sovereignty of the individual, and then we all give our freedom to the state in order for the state to protect us. So we become incorporated voluntarily into a kind of state structure, and of course for Hobbes, that state structure is a legitimization of basically constitutional monarchy as he sees it from his own experience. But I think the more important development is the Lockean perspective rather than the Hobbesian one, in that Locke's conception of the state as the protector of fundamental freedoms, we might also call them rights, but calling them rights gets us into the question of having to define what we mean by rights. Alternatively, we might call them the entitlements of the persons, or simply the provisions of the state. In the famous Lockean sense, life, liberty, and property, that's what the state ought to do. And I think that becomes really the fundamental conceptualization of the state. A structure that guarantees these fundamental entitlements to the person. The person gives up, like in the Hobbesian sense, his freedom, a part of his own individual sovereignty to the state, and then the state protects life, liberty, and property. I would say that becomes the fundamental definition of the liberal state.
Marxist theory differs because it sees the state as molded by economic relations, which then determine political realities and relationships. But as with much writing about Marx, one of the problems is there are different perspectives and takes on what Marxism actually is. Things are often more complicated, as Nikos Trimikliniodis explains.
There is a core which has the basic Marxist perspective, or a school of thought, which contains various theorizations of the state. Even within the work of Marx himself, you could identify various aspects because it's a very complex aspect. The state is not one thing, it's many things at the same time. There is, of course, they all have together something, they all have something in common. What the Marxist perspectives on the state have is that they think that there is a locus of power. Mm-hmm. It is essentially some sort of system of political hegemony, of political domination, and it has some relationship with one group of society, one class, which benefits more and usually at the expense of others. So this is the basic features of Marxist perspectives. But within Marx, you can say that there are quite a few approaches. I mean, the early Marx spoke about the state as a parasitic organization which exploited an oppressed society at large, and particularly the working classes. There are other references whereby Marx speaks of the state as an epiphenomenon, as a superstructure of something else, which is property relations, mm-hmm. and the exploitation of one group over the other. There's also other approaches where the state sort of looks after the long-term interests. So it's a factor of cohesion for the reproduction of the whole system. And there is, of course, the very famous reference in the Communist Manifesto, which speaks of the state as an instrument for class oppression. It's the executive committee for the whole of the bourgeoisie, which organizes matter for the body. So it's a very instrumentalist approach. And of course, there is this broader approach, which Marx speaks about, and the various Marxists, as a system of domination, hegemony, which has specific class effects on different classes and the class struggle. So it's a broad system which has a lot of flexibility. It uses coercion and consent, to achieve its aim. So it's based on, which is related usually to people like Antonio Gramsci. So these are the various approaches to Marxist theories of the state. Often they're in conflict between them, or many times you can actually see them as complementing each other. It depends on how you use these approaches. And the point is, there are certain crude approaches to Marxism, or what we call Valka Marxism, as well as the more sophisticated and more analytical approaches to the state.
Theory, however, is always grounded in a historical past. Errol Kaymak explains.
The problem with understanding through theory is that it's just so distant, isn't it? Because, there's something written in a book, but then there's a real world on which that was written, right? So, a couple years ago, I took my kids to London, and we went to the Tower of London. It was really interesting because you always think of the Tower of London as a place where they would keep people as prisoners, and it was a nasty place. But in fact, it was like the origins of the state. It was where they had an armory and they collect taxes. So that's how we have to understand the state, where it came from. And you might understand then liberal theory as a reaction to what was happening at the time, especially in English society. If you have a civil war, one reaction is that you have to have a sovereign that's going to protect life, if not liberty, right? So that's a much more maximalist solution. And if you're a little bit more optimistic and you think that an overbearing state and a monarch or king who's too powerful is going to strip you of all your assets, then you need something like the Magna Carta. Right? You need some constitutional limits on what the writ of the king would be, right? So if you think of it that way, the liberal theory originates from that debate about where the limits of power of the state should be.
Nikos Trimigliniodis shares the same view from a Marxist perspective.
The liberal theory of the state emerged at one historical moment, and it was a very important innovation against absolutism, against the logic of the power, and mainly this is a Western concept, in a Western world, where absolutism there was a need, and there was a need by the emerging class, the bourgeoisie at the time, the ruling class. They knew the emerging capitalist class, as well as the people who want to impose some limitations on the state. So the idea of the limited state was a very positive historic contribution of liberal theory, which said, and that's when the constitutionalism emerged as a limit, saying, hang on a moment, you can't have absolute power, it has to have some limits. Of course, liberal theory responded then and reflected the historical moment, and the interest, of course, of one class, if you take a Marxist perception of things. And at the core of it was the protection of liberty, limiting the state, was to protect liberty, but also to protect property. If in some ways it is about protection of liberty to have property, and that was at the core. Now, when the struggles for equality were also presented, and part of the state is that we're all equal before the law, they developed this notion that the state should be a neutral arbitrator. It would arbitrate between different groups who are in conflict, and this would be neutral, it would be fair, it would be democratic, and all the rest of it. Now, of course, it would have been good if that worked. In reality, we know that the state is not just that. It doesn't just reflect, it has never been neutral. It has always reflected the strength of various social forces in society, and it was used also as an instrument in various moments. It's a system of political domination. So I think that the limitations of liberal theory, as well as Weberian theories of the state, is that they are based on a false conception of what the state is about. It's based on an ideal version of what the state ought to be about, not what the state is about. And I think this is the first and most important criticism of the state. The state is not neutral. The state has class elements, has gender perspectives. It's also often racialized against one ethnic group. It has, so all these are the limitations of the liberal theory.
In contrast, Odysseas Christou argues in favor of the main contributions of liberal theory.
Well, the main contribution, I think, is very practical in the sense that this has been co-opted historically and in practice by the major developments of representative democracy, both in the United States and in France. We see in this practical adoption of the Lockean principles the application of liberal theory. So in the US Declaration of Independence, there is the definition of the so-called unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And of course, life, liberty, and property for the Americans becomes life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness because they have a real issue with property, because they own people. So slavery becomes for the United States the fundamental sticking point in the evolution of representative democracy, which of course gets resolved with the Civil War. But even with that problem, we see the adoption of the Lockean ideal. Same with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, which defines natural. That gets us into a whole different discussion of what natural rights mean, but natural and imprescriptible rights of liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. In other words, these are the fundamental things which the state must protect at all times. These are aspects of individual sovereignty that it does not get to take away from the individual. So I would say that's the main contribution of liberal theory. Actual application and influence on political decisions and political configurations of the states that come to define representative democracy, at least in the West, and that then becomes at least ostensibly an ideal, a global ideal in terms of application.
According to sociologist Max Weber, what differentiates modern society from traditional society is the modern state. From the cradle to the grave, the state exists, as Errol K. Muck explains.
We're all living in the state. We take it for granted, but we all have birth certificates, and we leave this world with death certificates. So it's from cradle to grave. What happens in between then is whether we have other things as well, right? Like a welfare state or not. And so, but the state is taken for granted. The state has police, the state has courts, the state prints money. So we couldn't imagine living in this world without the state, without its jurisdiction, all over the globe virtually. Of course, you know that technically there's no state in Antarctica, and technically there's no state jurisdiction over the moon, but I'm sure if there was a murder on the moon, someone would declare that they had jurisdiction.
Of course, this idealized Weberian perspective has its critics, particularly when societies are divided by issues of ethnicity, class, and the nation.
Well, the idea, if you assume the state is neutral, okay, and there is conflict between ethnic groups, and the ethnic groups are not just ethnic groups. There are also social classes within them. There are class relations, and there are class projects taking place within and beyond and outside the ethnic conflict. So ethnicity and class also work. If you have a very crude perception of what it's about, and you think that the state can become a neutral arbitrator between ethnic groups and between classes, you can understand how much far away is the theory of the state, theory of the nation, from actual social and political and economic reality. So we have a situation where all these complicated, difficult relations, the contradictions that exist between nation, state, and class are reflected in how we understand either how the conflict emerged, how the conflict developed within a divided society such as Cyprus, such as Israel, Palestine, or Turkey, or if you take any other country which has conflicts of this kind, and you have, or how you see this developing in the future. So your whole approach to how to resolve the conflict, which is based on your knowledge of the past and the present, is tainted and very, very naive and very problematic. So you have a whole system of analysis which is so poor that cannot capture reality. And if you try to impose a solution, it will simply not work, because the paradigm, which is simply so far distant from what actually exists in the real social relations. And I think this is a major problem, not just a theoretical problem, it's a political problem, it's a policy problem. It applies at each level of our understanding of the problematic of the nation and the state.
According to Jürgen Habermas, the modern state is undergoing a legitimation crisis, particularly in relation to the current EU-Eurozone financial crisis. And this has affected many nation states like Cyprus, Greece, Spain, Ireland, Portugal, and Italy. Scholars approach this matter in different ways. Odysseas Christou suggests
the financial crisis illustrated a few things. One, the interconnections, the inability to escape from these developments. So Cyprus in that case is a very good example, because right prior to, there's also a practical personal consideration here. I was in the crisis when I was in the United States and came to Cyprus in 2009 and basically brought the crisis to Cyprus with me in some sense. But I remember coming to Cyprus in 2009, public officials speaking about the fact that Cyprus is not part of this. Cyprus is very secluded from globalization and all these developments, and I was thinking to myself, how naive that to think that in the way that the world works today, any state can assume to be impervious to crises, to the global nature of crises. So these have to do with very practical, tangible considerations like how business works, how international business works, how international markets work, how the financial world works. And within that, we have all these demands that we are placing on the state. So the state should be doing these things. One of the major considerations of Habermas is social security. So increasingly what we find is that states are unable to cope with the demands of social security provision. So how do we reconcile that? This is not a philosophical question. And I can assure you that for those who sit in Brussels thinking about these things in terms of providing a European ideal, not as an ideal but also in practice, they need to grapple with these questions. So we try to put in place some things that perhaps are unsustainable, that we cannot put into practice, not again on the basis of their philosophical conditions, but practical realities.
Finally, the crisis is seen differently by Nikos Thrimikliniodis, who highlights the inability of the state and capitalism to deal with changing realities.
This crisis happens to coincide a number of different crises together, which shape it as a very, very specific type of crisis. And I think it presents us with a major challenge for theory. How do we theorize the specificity of this crisis within the wider historical context of understanding crisis in capitalist society, and the fact that people do not stop believing in democracy? So stop believing in a democracy generates new types of reactions to what is going on, and we see the emergence of new subjects, new socialities are emerging who are left out, because once you destroy the welfare state, once you destroy the sociality of the state, what happens to all these people who are drop out of society? What happens with the rejects? And there are so many of them, of different types, that before you would look after, and the idea of citizenship, of the social aspect of citizenship, at least as it emerged after the Second World War, was to include, to co-opt the lower classes, to co-opt the working classes by providing them with the basic welfare. Once you cut this out, and this is what has happened, and once the democracy cannot respond to this, what will that mean? It means social upheaval. It means all sorts of new potentialities emerging that we don't know about. It emerged. I mean, we have tried to think about these terms in terms of the work we recently have done to try what we call austerity citizenship. Citizenship outside the usual concepts, because it's no longer viable, it's no longer relevant. And also it's a citizenship which is ridden by the boundaries of the state. So you find people who are dropped out or who are outside the system, migrants, for instance, irregular migrants who are outside the system. What happens to them? They are moving, and they are producing new realities, and they are the result of the crisis at the same time. So we are seeing the emergence of subjects which are changing matters. We find, what happens to the new landless, the new people, the new homeless. I mean, in Spain, if you look at the example of Spain, hundreds, thousands of people are made homeless as a result of the economic crisis. In Cyprus now we have a situation where 54% of the loans are non-performing loans. But the government is saying, what people are saying, they are strategically non-performing loans. When 54% of the loans for households are non-performing loans, how can you say that these people have money and they cannot pay, when unemployment has reached the point of 17% amongst on average, and it's about 45% amongst the young, and you find a massive increase in poverty. Now, this is just one example. Cyprus is small. You could say, it's usually presented as an exception. It's an exceptional situation, but it's no exception, because look what's going on in Greece. Greece is in its sixth year of the crisis. Look what's going on in Spain, Italy. Italy now is a big question mark in the EU. Portugal. Or Ireland. Ireland is supposed to be has supposed to be a successful implementation. Has supposed to have finished from a program of its own memorandum. What we have now is a complete destruction, poverty, unemployment, and all sorts of social problems after the finishing of the banking crisis. So what I'm trying to say is that we are dealing with problems which show that we're unable to resolve with the current state interventions, with the current mechanisms that we have. We need to think beyond these. And I think it is a new form of legitimation crisis, if we're going to go back to Habermas. It's a new form, it's a specific form of crisis that needs to be addressed.